Hello, everyone. We'll start in just a moment. Welcome. It's so delightful to see so many of you here. Hello and welcome, everyone. We are excited that so many of you could join us live for today's webinar, Collective Trauma in Our World Today. My name is Sherry, your technical host for today's event. If you have any technical difficulty, our support team is available now to address any tech issues, comments, or concerns. You can contact support by emailing onlinecoursesupport@thomashübl.com. Again, that's online course support at thomashübl.com. We invite you to submit questions at any time by clicking on the Q&A button found at the bottom of your Zoom window or by tapping on the screen on your mobile device. And now I am pleased to bring on our host for today's event, Richard. Welcome, Richard.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Sherry, and welcome everybody here today. This is the Healing Collective Trauma Live webinar series with Thomas Hübl, and this video is called Collective Trauma in Our World Today. And we've had over 10,000 people register for the series already, which is wonderful. My name is Richard Taubinger, and I'll be your host during this series. I've been working with Thomas and his team on last year's summit on collective trauma, as well as on his upcoming summit scheduled for the fall called the Collective Trauma Summit 2020, The Power of Collective Healing. Let me give you a quick introduction to Thomas Hübl for those of you who may be new to his work. Thomas is a spiritual teacher and a speaker, author, and the founder of the Academy of Inner Science. He has worked with more than 100,000 people worldwide through workshops, multi-year training programs, and online courses. Last year, Thomas hosted the Collective Trauma Online Summit. That summit attracted over 50,000 participants, and that was before the global pandemic, the protests, and other crises people are going through right now. This fall, we have a new summit called Collective Trauma Summit 2020, The Power of Collective Healing. This topic has never been more relevant, and Thomas is bringing forth this whole new field of study in the world. Also, just a quick mention that Thomas has a forthcoming book on collective trauma that will be published later this year. This is the first in a series of 3 videos on collective trauma that are completely free. I wanted to say a quick reminder from what Sherry mentioned earlier that you can type in questions at the bottom of your screen on the Zoom call, and we'll be monitoring those throughout the broadcast. So I'd like to turn this over to Thomas now. I know this is a subject near and dear to you, collective trauma in our world today. Thomas, welcome today.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, and hello, everybody. Welcome.
So I thought we'd begin, Thomas, could you share a little bit about how you've crafted this series? And I know this is a series of 3 webinars, so can you explain the 3 live events and how they'll flow through?
Yes. So obviously, given the current state of our world and the events that are happening all around the globe, we wanted to present this kind of free webinar series to bring our attention to, of course, collective trauma. So today we will talk about the nature of collective trauma and why I feel it's so important to speak about trauma and collective trauma. Like my personal life biography and story within a context that is much older and that has an effect onto me, onto the way we create society, onto the societal issues that we see right now. So we'll talk about this later. And next time we will look at the powerful function of collective witnessing and creating collective healing containers, fields, large groups of people coming together to look at what are collective healing modalities of the future. Like what are we growing into? Because I believe we are growing into a much more collective way of healing together. And I think that's also collective trauma needs a collective vessel, needs us together to integrate the legacy of our past in order to open a new future for ourselves, for our children, for our world. And then in the last talk, we will have a look at how we create resilient communities, because collective trauma is, on the one hand, what happened in our history before we came, but it's also what's happening right now. COVID is, I think, one collective trauma that we are experiencing and going through right now. Maybe the economic reverberations that's gonna have. And of course, like on the doorsteps, even if our newspapers are currently not full of it, but on our doorsteps is the climate crisis is still standing there. And so we have a like contemporary collective trauma that activates the trauma of the past. So I think how we create resilience, individual and community resilience, I think is an important topic too. So these are the three calls.
Yeah, it's going to be a nice flow through. And I just want to share deep gratitude for you, Thomas, for, bringing forth this new body of work. And I think there's really never been a time it's needed more. And I know some people here have been following you for a while, and there also might be some new people here too. Could you maybe start off by sharing what collective trauma is, and maybe give us a higher level context from how we can view collective trauma as a whole?
Right. So let's say collective trauma, of course, is a complex topic. It's when we look at the world. So let's say we all know how do we know the world? Because we had astronauts that went into space, into outer space, and made a photo. But that's an important process. It means the moment I become aware of what I'm part of, I create a bigger perspective, and I can look and see, oh, wow, actually, I'm part of this living system, and now I get a perspective to look at it. In the consciousness development, we call this subject-object transcendence. That when I'm so identified with something, I can't see it. In the moment I have a bigger perspective, a higher consciousness that I develop in my also childhood and adult development, then suddenly I'm able to witness what I was in before. So when we look at this blue marble, it looks like a very beautiful blue planet. And when you zoom in closer, you don't immediately see how hurt that planet is. But if we come into our lives, and if you just look in the US, Civil War, Native American genocide, slavery, like racism, when you look in Europe, World War II, or in the planet, on the whole planet, World War II, and a Holocaust, you look in the Middle East, you look in Asia, you look in Latin America, in Africa, in Australia and New Zealand. So all the continents are full of scars, but we don't see those scars. Why? It's like when we are a fish in the water and we never saw air. Water is so natural. Only when you look at the water, you see, oh, there's water. So we got to know through amazing researchers, scientists, therapists, like we got to know a lot about trauma. What is trauma? We learned to study our nervous system. We pioneers, did a lot of work with clients or with fMRIs and all kinds of neuroscience methods. We know more and more how trauma affects us. We know more and more how attachment trauma affects us, the ACEs studies. So there's a lot of big body of work that is growing every day that shows us how important is trauma and how fundamental to our health and to our societal health trauma is. And when we look for a moment at what's the nature of trauma, trauma has been going on for thousands of years. That's why it's so hard for us to see. We have been born into a world that is traumatized to a certain degree. It's not only traumatized, but it's also traumatized. So I grow up in a world where trauma is kind of normal. That's the only world that I know. If I grow up in it, it's the only world that I know. And so that means that the conditioning of trauma, that for example, in many people, their mental expression and their physical emotional expression is fragmented. Because trauma is a process when somebody has an overwhelming experience, a strongly overwhelming experience. We need to fragment the part in order to survive better. So we shut down a part of ourselves. But here is a lot of stress. Later in our life, we see that in relationship situations, in situations with our kids, in situations at work, in situations in society, when we need to solve issues together as a society, we see how fragmented our societies are. Which makes it much harder to deal with a collective situation like now, like with COVID. It's a lot of forces pulling in all kinds of directions. That's fragmentation.
Well, I know you've talked about it, that we're born into a trauma matrix and that it's hard to actually even know what's healthy. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's correct. And what you're saying is very important, because it's not that many of us went outside and had a look at the collective trauma field, and now we can say what it is, because we all carry it inside. If we grew up, like I recently, in one of our workshops, a woman said, I grew up in Germany and after the war, and there was, when I was 16, for the first time, I saw a video of a concentration camp. I grew up in a dead silence. So let's imagine somebody grows up in there was a catastrophe, and then silence. And a child growing up in a creepy silence, feeling that something major is in the room, but there's no reference, there's no orientation, there's no clarification. How does this affect a 1-year-old, 2-year-old, 3-year-old, 4-year-old, 5-year-old, and so on, child growing up? We grow up in the fragmented field. Like it's like a window, and you take a stone and you crash the window, and you see the cracks in the window, and then we look at the world through those cracks, and then we learn that that's the world. The world with the cracks is the world, and it's very important that we understand that we carry the collective trauma history in us. That's what is built into our looking, that's built into our speaking, it's built into our sensing, to our feeling. It's built into the numbness, the parts that we don't feel, and the numbness in our society. Otto Scharmer puts it beautifully with social absencing. And in social absencing, we see social pathologies flourish. And that's why I'm saying it. I think we need, like we learned a lot about individual trauma, and now we see that there's a much bigger context, a whole net. Because if parents are traumatized and the attachment process doesn't work well, their parents most probably were traumatized or went through traumatizing situations. So there's a whole net. And I think it's very important to do the individual trauma work, but it's equally important that we have kind of an awareness process that we start, how the collective, the society, is built partly on healthy structures. It's like a house. Part of the bricks are bricks, and part of the bricks are ice. They're frozen. They cannot develop. Trauma doesn't want to develop because trauma is frozen. It's frozen energy. They cannot move. And so when we say, okay, why are we not responding differently to climate change? Yeah, because part of our society is frozen. And then we try to create the pressure, and that pressure only has a backlash because the frozenness doesn't want to move. It's scared. It's very stressed. And that's why I often say a skilled trauma therapist sees the symptoms in a traumatized person, but knows there's something deeper that creates them. And I think we need the same for our societies, for our cultures, for parts of our societies, for organizations, that we see that there are symptoms And then there is a deeper source that creates those symptoms. And as I said before, and why is that important? Because when we see, for example, in Europe, that there is a refugee stream coming from the Middle East, and that refugee stream, many people that come from a war situation into countries that have a Cold War situation, like have a trauma layer of a war that happened 70, 80 years ago, and that reactivates each other. So we see what kind of effects that creates in the European Union. And so when we just imagine when there are more and more climate change effects, we need to be resilient and we need to be changeable. Like to have the ability to change, adaptable, but for me, it's not only adaptable, it's the ability to change. And trauma reduces the ability to change. Habits also reduce it, but habits I can change. Trauma, I need to heal. So
well, I think what's interesting is that every culture has different types of collective trauma, but is there an overarching structure for how collective trauma unfolds that's similar? Does that make sense? Because
there is. And what is similar is that trauma always comes with two major symptoms. One is numbness. I cannot feel. And the societal aspect of it is indifference. I don't engage when I have to. Or the other side is stress, hyperactivation, a strong agitation. That means I overreact when something happens. So there is over and there is no. And so in relationships, it might be that I can't feel you when I'm with you. The micro unit of relation is I feel you feeling me. That's the micro unit of relation. That's what creates the attachment process. That's what creates a healthy attachment, relationship, relational capacities. Trauma hurts that. So then we walk around more disembodied. We walk around more hurt in our emotional fields. We walk around partly numb and partly very stressed. So we overreact. Reacting is acting before we feel. Responding is an action that is informed by feeling. So I felt the situation and then I respond to it. And feeling is also feeling and thinking together. Is I can cognitively comprehend, I can feel, and that makes responsiveness or the ability to respond, like responsibility, the ability to respond. And it's different when in a relationship argument we react or we respond. Respond is a mature function. Reactivity is a regressive function. And we see a lot of reactivity in our cultural context is the same. And that's why, so all around the world, we see similar symptoms. We see the heat of the hyperactivation, and we see the numbness, which causes social absence. Patches of our society that are unfelt, uninhabited. We might be there, but we are not there because we're absent. And then in those areas, all kinds of stuff is happening because we are not responsive to
right. And I think that's the power of some of the work that's being brought forth by you, because I think in most people they're unaware completely of what trauma they have, and then when they look at other people, if they're not aware of their own collective trauma, then they're definitely not going to be able to feel what other people are going through. Is that true?
That's very true. And that's true. So more and more we see now, more and more people start to do trauma work. Some people become aware that we are traumatized. And traumatized doesn't mean that I needed to have a car accident or go through a war. Like we know that trauma is much more refined. There's all kinds of attachment traumatizations that many of us carry in one way or the other in ourselves. So there are more and more great therapy methods and modalities that work on that and help us to become more integrated, more mature, more grown up. And I think that's beautiful. And what that does for us is exactly what you said. It increases compassion, it increases presence, it increases relatedness, it increases clarity, it increases seeing, it increases resilience. So it increases many factors, and it's a win-win-win. Why? Because when there's trauma, energy is frozen. So all our fridges now at home, what are they doing? So everybody who's listening, what's your fridge doing?
Hopefully it's running and freezing things, right?
It's freezing things.
Yeah.
Who pays the bill?
All of us do, right?
All of us. We are all paying electricity, although we are not aware of our, not only because I said it now, but most probably 2 minutes before you didn't think of your fridge.
Right.
Like, so that there is something working to freeze.
Right.
When I'm traumatized, there's all the time energy. I need to invest all the time energy to keep it frozen. That's life energy that I don't have for my creative expression, for my intimacy, for my love, for my compassion, for my contribution to society. When we integrate trauma, we not only we save the energy that we need to freeze, we gain the energy that we didn't have, the world grows, and I make a bigger contribution to the world too.
Well, I think in the United States, especially, what you see is like we were going to initially name this video the reemergence of dormant trauma. And in the United States, just recently, you and I are two white people, but in the United States, there's been this reemergence of, with Black Lives Matter. And for the reaction for some has been to ignore it and almost to just stay silent and not address it. Could you talk a little bit about how that in itself is maybe an issue? And how like neglect is re-traumatizing in the world today, how we all need to kind of be taking part of looking at what is arising in our culture and being part of that.
Of course. And even more so, I think we really have to turn towards and look at the pain that we have inflicted in many ways. And I think it's very scary for some people, and it's much better to turn away and kind of ignore it for some people, but we have to turn towards. That's why it's so important that it comes much more into the public sphere, because all those are moments, opportunities of a deep healing. And I think it's very important what you said, but the numbness on all sides, basically, and the hyperactivation, like we have to learn how to heal the underlying trauma together. And I think that's very scary, but it's very important that we have the spaces to do that. And it also means that we need to become aware of the societal structures that prevent it. And those societal structures are built by us. And so I think that's a very complex process, but I think it's a very important process. And turning towards our legacy and seeing the fragmentation that our ancestors, and maybe we, without knowing, or maybe knowingly, we created some of it too, because we perpetuated that trauma. And to turn towards it's not an easy process. And it needs a lot of courage, and it needs the ability to feel discomfort. And I think we have to feel the discomfort of the pain of the past in order to open up a new future together. And that's why I think it's very important. And it's also, I have done a lot of work on the Holocaust trauma and on the Germany, Israel, and of course the Second World War. And it's a complex process to really go together and be in such a kind of transformation process. But the outcome is amazing, I think, and that's exactly what I believe we are walking towards, is a much higher collective healing capacity that we develop together. That's going to be the future of healing, and I believe also the future of medicine and psychology is going into a kind of a collective dimension.
So that kind of, sorry, we're going to say something more?
Yeah, And I think it's also very important to see that if in a system, like with a traumatized person, if somebody is traumatized and something happens in an intimate relationship or at work, the person has a 10 times higher volume experience than another person that is not traumatized on that level. So the intensity of how we experience the situation might be much stronger, and other people might say, hey, what's happening to you? But for the person, it's really that intense. And that's very important. And the same is true for a system. Like if in the system there's a lot of fragmentation, it's like canyons, or when soil is dry, then you see the cracks. So we see the cracks in our society. That's all the unhealed wounds that we didn't want to look at, we kind of denied. And when there's more stress in the system, those fragmentations will come up stronger, which on the one hand is an opportunity for us to really look at it and for us to really do some transformational work. If we don't look at it, it's also a dangerous situation, because the fragmentations might create all kinds of situations up to creating new wars. So I think that's very, and especially with the climate change, with the climate crisis coming, and so there's more and more stress that we will feel on the planet. So we have to move.
Yeah, thank you. Could you share a little bit about how collective trauma gets created and then passed through the generations and then re-triggered?
Right. So what, as I said, I can speak only from what I have seen. And as I said, 18 years ago, when I started to run groups and workshops, I wasn't really looking for collective trauma. But then since I was working a lot in Europe, it simply appeared again and again and again. And then I started to study that. And so how that appears to me is that unresolved trauma creates imprints. And I think our epigenetic and genetic landscape is also there for us to learn something. It's a learning process through the generations. And I think it's very important to see, for me, the body is not my personal property. The body is hundreds of thousands of years old, older and older. My nervous system is hundreds of thousands of years old. I didn't invent the nervous system. I didn't invent emotions. I didn't invent most of the things that I'm thinking. So it's like there's a long history. That's because when we look at traditions or spiritual traditions, we are all part of one tradition. That's humanity. That's life. It's even more bigger than humanity. It's life. That's our tradition. And so there is depth. When you look at fake news is like information without history, without tradition. Information is informing something that has a root. And when we look at trauma, so when trauma is not being resolved, or in the near future after it happened, so then it crystallizes more and more, and it's being passed on from one generation to the next. And then we have two options, because from the moment it's being passed on, we have no biographical correlation in our life to the stress we might feel, or to some relationship issues, or issues of expression, or finding our purpose in life, or earning money, or many issues in our life. And so we call this personal issues, but they go back to, there's a source. And so when we see our existence as part of the tradition of life, we see that some symptoms in our life are not really our personal stuff. They're already embedded in a much wider transgenerational kind of transmission. And that's why I feel we more and more see that trauma healing is first of all a personal process, but then it's a transgenerational and collective process. So it's all of it. It's the collective trauma, like a big impact on society, like the Civil War in the US or the Second World War, is a big impact. But then the reverberations are very, very, very strong. And so when we see what's actually the effect of a war on life, it's hundreds of years sometimes that life tries to dilute and integrate slowly the massive wounds of a war. It's much wider. Like, I think if we were to animate the impact of a war over the course of 300 years, we would see how massive are the effects. And that's why I believe either we go through generations of life issues, or we put a lot of energy into a conscious healing process. Like,
Right.
we take our conscious awareness and we start to develop methods to heal that reduces the suffering on the planet by far, because it speeds up the integration process. And maybe the last thing is that, you know, we all know that when we hurt ourselves, when we cut ourselves, or when we are hurt, the body tries to heal itself if it can. And there is a self-healing mechanism in our body, but I believe there's a self-healing mechanism in the collective body too. And that's a tremendous resource. And I think we need to make more use of that resource and use it consciously.
We have some great questions coming in. And a few, Diana's asking, how do we teach our children about traumatic history in a compassionate way? And then how do we help our youth see the possibility of a healthy future when this generation is born into, say, an unhealthy system? And I think both you and I have children. I think this is kind of these are interesting questions. So how can we help our children to understand this as well?
Right, with our children, it's, I believe it's complex, because we need to find a way, I believe parenting is a process of deep relation. And what is a parent? A parent is like a pillar in the child's life. And a healthy attachment process means that the child knows that that pillar is there. And then the child can come, find safety, protection, nourishment, love, orientation, and guidance, potential oriented, like that the parents recognize the potential and the intelligence of the child, and like everything is held in a loving environment. I'm talking about the kind of more ideal version of the attachment process. But there are certain vitamins the parents can have to give to their children in order to support the next generation to develop. And so there is protection, there is orientation and leadership, and there is relation. So through I feel you feeling me, that's the most primary unit of relation. I feel that you feel me, and you feel that I feel you. When we feel each other, there is a kind of a mechanism of safety. Because once we feel each other, there's a human relation. When we don't feel each other, we are a little bit already agitated. It's not fully safe. Because safety is kind of there's a word, neuroception, that through our nervous system, we constantly check if the environment is safe. And now when we meet our children at the given age, if a child is 3 years old, 5 years old, and children ask questions, the relation will inform us what is actually the information that the child can absorb, and what is the information that immediately traumatizes my child. Because it's too much, it's too overloading. And when I don't feel myself, I'm more likely to overwhelm my child. And when I feel myself, I can step by step kind of bring the orientation and the leadership to the child's experience, because the child will ask questions. The child will ask, why is it actually that this and that is happening in our society? And then it needs us as parents to be there and give an orientation and not let the child be in the limbo. So I think the main answer is about the relational capacity, that I feel my child's capacity to what the child can understand and what overwhelms my child. And then it becomes actually like a small traumatization for the child. If I show a child a Holocaust film and the child is too early, then that's not education. That's an overwhelm. So that's not orientation and leadership. But if the child is old enough to understand this and to be able to absorb it, then it's different. So that's why it's always the dose, like the amount of information and the way it's being delivered. And if I'm in a felt relation with my child, so that my child feels safe with me in the exploration. I think that's the ideal version. And of course, since we all are more or less able to do that, that's a learning process for us.
I think there's a lot coming in and people are asking, well, so what do we do? How do we do this? And I think we're going to progress through this whole series as we move through. There's a question here. There's two questions that I think are really relevant to just setting the framework. And one is, what's the difference between, say, a trauma that's more event-based, say the Holocaust, and then healing trauma that is more residual, that continues every day, like racism and violence and like systematic trauma. Can you speak about like how some are event-based and how some are actually start to embed in the different structures of society themselves?
Right. Yeah, the important thing is that both are being passed on. And both need, in order to change it, we need some kind of awareness process to stop the transmission. And the transmission cannot be stopped just by stopping it. Like the healing of trauma goes through our body. Trauma is not being healed through a merely cognitive process. Even if I understand that it's there, it doesn't yet do the work. Because trauma is, I was so overwhelmed that I needed to split off a part of myself in my nervous system. Like you shut down a room in your house in order to save the rest. But then I need to open the door again because otherwise I can't use that room ever again. And so when we open the door, there's still all the stress and the pain and the emotional content and all the stress in the nervous system waiting. And so when we step by step, in a good way, in a skilled way, open the door so we can clean that room, open the windows, and make it a livable room again. So then I feel suddenly, wow, I feel myself again, and I feel you again. That's very important. When I heal, the world also heals, because you happen in me again. That's compassion, that I can feel you in myself creates I feel you feeling me. And often in trauma that's being perpetuated, there is an unseen othering or dissonance in between us that we don't feel each other. So on the one hand, it's good to know about it and to be informed, but the real work is in the depth. We have to clean the chimney together. And that's why, that's what reduces othering, because a deep trauma symptom is separation, isolation, numbness, othering. And within those spaces, all kinds of re-traumatizations are happening. So it's to re-own that and start to feel again is to release the anesthesia that a part of humanity is in, given all our histories. And I believe that's also the severe degree of disembodiment, because there are rooms in our house, if our body is the house, so there are rooms that are closed. But if there's a room closed in me and there's a room closed in you, Richard, those rooms, they create a field of absence. And if millions of people have that, then we have big patches. It's like when you sit on a plane and you look down onto a city and you turn off the power, the electricity in part of the city, and it goes dark, that's social absencing. That a part of our social fabric is absent, and then we are fighting the polarization. On top of it, there's a polarization, but that polarization is stuck because the forces are down there.
Right.
And I think we need to learn how to be down there in a skillful way.
Yeah, I love that analogy. And I'm sure all of us have rooms that the lights are off and dark. And I think what you've highlighted, and a couple of questions have come in, is what's the relationship between, say, personal trauma and collective trauma? And what I hear you saying here is that we do the individual work and then we start to feel more. And by feeling more, then we can actually connect in a meaningful way. Is that correct? To the collective trauma of others?
That's right. That's right. That we need to do first our individual work, our individual healing work. And the people, it's always like in society, like everybody who has resources and can give more resources, it like consciousness comes with responsibility because I'm able to respond. And if I have the resources and somebody else needs them, so then there is a healthy exchange. So whenever somebody can give something for other people to be healing deeper, so that's our service. And when we use those resources in the society well, then we can distribute them in a way that makes the healing more accessible to everybody. Because then healing is not just for some people available and for many not. It becomes like a shared field. That's why I believe we're gonna move into a much more collective healing world. So we do our individual work first because that helps us to take care of the most immediate pain and suffering in ourselves. And that opens the gates that we can expand our awareness to deal with either it's like a cross. It's the past and the future. Here's the future, here's the past. And here is 2020 now. And so there's horizontal relations. So we grow our awareness more outwardly, and we grow our awareness more into the past, and we grow our awareness into the future, which is the potential world that we are walking into. And I deeply believe that through trauma healing, we create a bigger world that our children will walk into. We open possibilities through the healing that our children will have a bigger world available than if we don't do that work.
I think what you're really saying is it's quite exciting because you're expanding the field of trauma, and it's not that it's exclusive, but it's even more inclusive because it's both individual and collective healing. And I've heard you say a few times, you have some phrases that I think are beautiful, but you've said that collective healing is the modality of the future, which I love. And you also said that we're moving into the age of collective healing. Those are your words, not mine. And is this field that's emerging how these two things blend together, the personal and the collective, and how people address trauma as a whole? Is that what you would say, or?
Right. I feel that now we learned a lot in the last 100 years or so. We did a lot of individual healing work and small group work. And I believe we learned a lot of skills. And now it's going to change a bit the correlation that we can build collective healing fields where individual healing's happening in. And I bring this often because I think it's a beautiful example when on Mount Zion in the Bible, like God speaks to the whole Israelites that are like it's a collective awakening, but within that moment, like the voice, like the most universal voice, the voice speaks, and everybody says, God spoke to me, to my personal life. That's very important. It's not that something abstract has been said. It's like as if the voice spoke to you, Richard, and you feel deeply seen in your personal life with all your context. And I feel the same. And she feels the same. And he feels the same. And the principle that's being described is the most universal is being expressed through the most specific. So everybody's specific life is a puzzle piece of the most universal, which means that consciousness development doesn't mean that we become all one soup, that we all through living our deepest individual life fully we are actually expressing the most universal. And my experience was with very large groups also, that there are moments where the group coherence, and that's what we're going to talk about next time also, when the group coherence is so high that hundreds and hundreds of people are fully present with one person sharing. And the one person sharing, and if a healing happens in one person, it's a ripple effect into everybody in the room, and everybody who carries a similar issue participates in the healing as well. But what that says is, if we come together and we bring the generosity and the presence and the compassion into a space to be there for everybody who is stepping in front of the community or the group, we actually participate. So we bring resources to the person, and the person brings something back to us. And I believe that's the archetypal function of a healthy society, that every individual on the planet, the place of that individual is important for the health of the whole. And I believe that's very important, because often when we look at individual health, we become a bit hypnotized by personal or individualism, or hyper-individualism is a thing in our time. And then also the understanding of health becomes very individualized. Whereas there's an individual aspect and there's a collective aspect to my body. My organs, part of my organs, are part of my relation to the collective. And so my individual and the collective relation that I carry within myself and everybody weaves a carpet of the collective of humanity. That's why every soul, everybody on the planet is equally important, because everybody carries a code of that universal whole. And I believe there's a very powerful healing principle in that. And I've seen this over and over and over again. And that's why I believe the collective healing presencing fields are an amazing healing resource for every one of us. So we become actually the collective healer of humanity. We become that collective healing force, and we become together the voice of the self-healing mechanism of humanity, or of the planet. It's bigger than humanity, it's the planet. And I think that's really exciting. There's a very strong force in that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really exciting, because sometimes it can feel like certain states and situations are hopeless in some ways. And I think what's interesting is often, with relationship therapists, often one partner doesn't want to be there or doesn't even show up. And I think on the collective side, it's the same thing, where it takes groups of people to come together that are ready to do the work, even if other people aren't ready to do the work. Would you say that? Exactly. And then it has a ripple on effect. Can you talk a little bit about that? Or
it's exactly what you said now. It's like, I ran once a training in Israel for a pocket project. It's kind of a non-profit for collective trauma integration. And we had multiple different colonialism, and like we had the Holocaust and big topics that we dealt with within this training. And at that time I had the feeling like as if or the violence between men and women. And so it's not only war situations, it's all kinds of collective trauma situations. And during this training, I had the feeling like as if I lifted the carpet and I looked into the underworld of the world, and the massive amount of pain. And then one could say, yeah, but there's so much trauma in the world, so we will never be able to deal with it. So yes, there is so much pain, and I think that's true. It looks like we see just the top of the iceberg, and there is, like in the collective unconscious, way more than we are even aware of. And that's true. On the other hand, I have seen the power of collective, and that's why the next call is going to be called collective witnessing, because I've seen the power of collective presence, which tremendously upgrades the capacity of what we are able to do. Collective presencing is a tremendous force. So when we see more and more people, like many groups, come together around the world and say, we have to take care of our legacy. We have to take care. It's like a lot of pain has been created, but we are the ones that can also take care of it. And we can stop that cycle of pain and turn it into a brighter future. And so when we create these collective containers skillfully, because it needs to be done skillfully, because it deals with strong like trauma fields, but we can learn how to do that, then we speed up the evolution of healing and the evolution of the world a lot. And so that's why I'm also hopeful. That's why, even if I'm aware of like also how big's the pain and the suffering in the world, but I'm also aware of the power that we have together in the intersubjective space, in the space between us. That's the place where light and conscious awareness, insight, innovation, and new possibilities come in. And I think we are moving into that world. And it's like another example that shows it. You know, today, even the technology that we talk now, you are sitting, I don't know, 6,000 miles away from me, but we are here together and we can feel each other, we can see each other, we can have an intimate conversation. And many, many people listen right now, is a function of the rational age. The same is like airplanes. Let's imagine in the pre-rational age, so you came with your airplane and landed in Rome at that time, or in Athens at that time, you would most probably be considered a miracle. Because there was no airplanes, and we didn't have airplanes, we didn't know how to build them, it didn't exist. So that's a function that is a miracle in the world before, but it's a function of a rational age that we create together, a scientific age. So let's see what's actually the next level of future that we are growing into, and what are the capacities that we don't even imagine at the moment that are possible. And so we need to see that the possibilities that we grow into are equally growing as we also become more aware of the pain that we are in. And I think that there is a hopeful future too. And that's, I think, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. I was just going to say, what you're highlighting is really pre-pandemic COVID. I would say that 80% of the population wasn't even on Zoom, you know, and now through technology, we actually have the possibility even to address this issue, because it's enabled the connection in a meaningful, real way. But what you're bringing forth is actually what needs to be done with the technology to make that happen. Yeah.
Right. And that we can do this offline, but the fact that we have the synchronizing technology, like now, we wouldn't have that conversation without the technology. And the fact, you know, I just came off a 6-day retreat with many people in person in one place and many people somewhere around the world. And the intimacy that we created in these 6 days, through the space, like people sitting in Australia and in Canada and in Israel and so when we learn to bridge the distance, the physical distance, through attunement, through consciousness, through relation, and through presence, then the world grows together into a very intimate space, even through technology. It's a consciousness that's being transmitted. And so if we use it wisely, if not our shadows or trauma use technology for addiction and all kinds of shadow sides that technology also has, of course, but if we use it with consciousness, then I think it's a real blessing, and it's part of that collective healing work that we are growing into. Definitely.
Yeah, that's great. And just one other body of questions. Does society itself have a self-healing mechanism, and can you talk a little bit about that and how might what we're talking about here actually create the next evolution of the self-healing mechanism within the consciousness of humanity?
Yes, because it's not to forget that my body is water, is soil, minerals, metals, proteins, electricity. It's like my body on one level, like, is the substance of the planet, is the planet. And then there is an emotional world, there's all kinds of worlds that have been created until the rational age and the scientific age, so that what our brains are able to do and our frontal cortices. But the fact is that we are all connected on all those levels. And I believe embodiment, when we are really embodied, then those feedback loops with the planet, with nature, the way how we live with animal farming, the way how we live in human societies, that on many levels we create like healthy feedback loops. When we are traumatized, we stop those feedback loops. So information can't flow. Like in a body, there's information. While I'm sitting here and talking to you, there's tons of information going up and down my spine, into my brain, from my brain. And that information informs every cell of my body. And the body informs my brain, my consciousness. And it goes back and forth and back all the time. And that's true for society too. But if we have big trauma pockets in society, big othering, big rifts, fractures, then the information can't flow. And that means the self-healing mechanism of when a person is too stressed chronically, it's very hard for the organism, maybe sometimes to sleep, maybe sometimes to find rest inside, and to become quiet, to meditate, to digest, to reflect, and to heal. We need a certain inner state of relaxation that the body can switch into self-healing. And the same is true for the societal body. If there's a lot of stress in our society and a lot of fragmentation, the self-healing mechanism that is there is partly blocked. But then we see often, and we heard it, like I heard many stories, like even in the situations like the Second World War, that certain people expressed amazing qualities, like were in very risked a lot of things, risked their life to be part of that self-healing and save many other people and do very courageous things that often haven't been even written in the history books, where you see how we are part of it. And also our healthcare system. I mean, our healthcare system is the physical manifestation of the self-healing mechanism. And I think that our healthcare system has enough energy, funding, life energy, like support for the healthcare stuff is super important, because that's the buffer for the society to heal, and to absorb a lot of trauma and crisis and pain. So the more that system is energized, it's a good sign, because it's a sign of the health of the society. And because it's part of keeping us healthy. And same as in our body. That's the societal expression of it. And so yes, there is the self-healing mechanism, but often traumatization blocks in a way that self-healing. And maybe finally to say that also when we talk about trauma, often it seems like that's our problem. But the fact that we are able to do that saved us. The fact that children that are being neglected can retract and save themselves in a way, or when there's a violent environment and there are defense patterns that look for grown-ups as problems, but as children, they really saved us. These are intelligent functions. And I think we have to learn more to listen to those intelligent functions and not call them weakness, not call them dysfunction, but to learn to hear the function on the level of development where it was very needed. It was an intelligent function then, and it might be perceived as a block in my life today. But there is an inherent intelligence in the way we try to survive the best. And I think that's also true for the collective body. And that when we learned, instead of judging it from the outside, to be able to experience it from the inside, I think that's where the wisdom of self-healing is being reactivated.
Okay. There's so much wisdom in everything you're saying. And I just reiterate, I so appreciate you sharing this with us today. And also the over 10,000 of you who signed up for this series. This is just the first in the series. And I always feel like I'm in a time warp when I'm with you, Thomas. Just captivated, and something deep within me just hooks in, and it's amazing. Would you like to maybe make any closing remarks, or kind of share a little bit about where we're going to go with the next couple of videos in the series?
Yeah, as I said before, the next time we will deal with like that fundamental healing principle and the collective witness. What is actually the collective witness? How are we becoming a witnessing function or the awareness function of our society? And what are healing containers? Like, how do we create healing fields to work on collective trauma? And in the call afterwards, we will look at, like, because we are the remedy too. That's the good news. We are the remedy. We carry the remedy inside, and one of the remedies is relation. It's like deep, meaningful relation is a fundamental remedy for trauma. Presence, attention, compassion, clarity. Like there are many elements that we can bring into the mix that are very beneficial. And I want to look also with the prospect of the next decade or decades, like when there are times that are more uncertain, or when more disruptions come that are unpredictable, when through climate change or through other disruptions, we will see like that, how to create resilience and what is actually resilience, and how do I have tools, individual tools and collective tools. Because if I create meaningful relation in my life, that's something that is part of our resilience. And that's something that stays. Even if other social structures drop away, if I create meaningful relations with the people around me, that's one part of resilience, let's say. And so we want to look at what is communal resilience and what can we do now to be prepared to stay in a uncertain time, fluid and adjustable, adaptable, creative, and be the source of new solutions and innovations for our world.
Yeah, thank you. And I think it's all about figuring out how to increase the capacities for individuals and groups to really work with what's arising and also what's already there. And there's been so many great questions asked, almost 50 plus. So we are not able to get into the very specifics, but in the next couple of videos, I think we'll drill down into some of the more detailed examples as well. Wish we had more time today. Thank you everybody for joining us. It's been a great opening session for understanding collective trauma in our world today. We'll send you a link to the replay for this video. And as Thomas said, the next video will be on the collective witness, which I think is a really fascinating topic. That is going to be another live event. It will be on July 26th. And he'll be speaking about this topic. And then we have the third event, which will be in August. We'll send you information on that. And just kind of on the horizon, we have a huge collective trauma 2020 summit that we've been planning with 25 plus speakers. This is going to be a big event where we're really bringing in all kinds of perspectives on this event, and we'll let you more about that. If you're watching this video as a record or watching the replay, I encourage you to share it on social media, share the link, and you can also forward the email that we send you. That really helps us to get more awareness about this issue, also about the work that Thomas and everybody around him is doing. Thanks again, Thomas, for spending time. Thanks for everybody for showing up. Any last minute remarks for everybody, Thomas?
Yeah, I think we said a lot, and thank you for listening, because that's exactly what creates collective awareness, what we are doing right now. So thank you, and thank you, Richard.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, everybody, and we look forward to seeing you in the next live event.